Today we're going to have a bit of a debate on the issue of selling your non-primaris Space Marines because of concerns about how long Games Workshop might continue to support them. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. Although today we're talking a little bit more about the real-world economics of managing your Space Marine army. I decided to make this video as I've heard plenty of anecdotes of people I know selling their Space Marines and reinvesting in the new Primaris models. This is going to be my take on whether or not this is a good idea or not, and please bear in mind that it's a complete opinion piece. We don't know exactly what Games Workshop is going to do in the future, so any predictions I make are purely that, they're just predictions. In any case, my short answer is generally that I don't think it's really worth selling old Marines at this point. But to justify my position, we're going to talk in depth a little bit more about the Primaris releases and what Games Workshop is likely to be doing going forward with them. So let's talk a little bit about the entire advent of Primaris Space Marines. They were released at the start of 8th edition, and unusually for Games Workshop, rather than directly replacing the units that they had similar battlefield roles to, they created new options within the Space Marine army and didn't take any miniatures out of the game. Primaris Marines are basically Games Workshop's way of refreshing the entire Space Marine range as a gradual bit-by-bit process. This has happened before from the very first archaic Space Marine box set that was made in plastic. It was one of the things that really got Games Workshop going. As miniature technology and aesthetics has progressed over the last few years, they got replaced by the standard Tactical Marine box set that looked a bit bigger and looked a bit nicer in my opinion. And then we had another re-release of Tactical Marines that included a lot more of the options for the squad. They were the same scale, but were just a little bit more flexible and a bit more finely detailed than that interim squad. Now Games Workshop is moving on again, with the basic Space Marine Troops choice now becoming the Intercessor, again an upscaled version of a Space Marine with some slight aesthetic tweaks. There was certainly demand for this out before they released them. Many people are happy to have updated sculpts for Space Marines, particularly ones that are a fair bit bigger than they were before, because in the background Space Marines tend to tower over normal humans like Guardsmen and other races' infantry, which wasn't really reflective of how big the models were in themselves. Now coming back to their idea of releasing units that fulfill roles alongside the existing units rather than replacing them, I think that was an interesting choice that Games Workshop took, and I think they did it for a number of different reasons. Partly because the Space Marine range is absolutely enormous and that's really diversified over the years, so replacing it all at once was just not ever going to be a possible task without drastically cutting down on the amounts of options that Space Marines have. Also, people have amassed vast quantities of Space Marines over the years, and by immediately calling all of those models outdated in one fell swoop, they might alienate a whole bunch of players from the hobby. And as a miniature company that sells miniatures, they don't really want to just hack off a large part of their customer base. So to get around the fact that you have two different sized Space Marines fighting together alongside each other on the board, they have decided to justify it in the background, with the return of Guilliman and Belisarius Corps making improvements on the Space Marine design, then these reinforcements being shipped out to all chapters as part of the Indomitus Crusade. Now some people really like the idea of technological advancement in the Imperium at long last. A lot of people were very annoyed at the idea of Games Workshop reasonably obviously crowbarring Primaris Marines into the background and potentially tearing up or invalidating a lot of the old traditions of 40k. I personally don't really mind the new additions, although I do appreciate the reversal of law in that the Imperium has always been a technological stagnant state, clinging to the advancements of ages past, and if they're farming out new and advanced Space Marines, then it does rather go against this image. Personally, I do like the majority of the Primaris models that they've released. In particular, I think the Intercessors were very well done, and I'm kind of fine with them making 40k a bit more of an ongoing narrative storyline rather than just a setting. That's all my own personal views though, and of course your mileage might vary. So that's kind of Primaris Space Marines in a nutshell, but it does mean that future Space Marine releases are almost entirely going to be Primaris Space Marines. As they are Games Workshop's way of updating the range, they're basically just going to be releasing more and more of them now, and any releases for the older, smaller scale Space Marines and Terminators will be more of a sideline thing. I believe some new sculpts came out in the Warhammer Heroes series, or occasionally for event exclusive models and things. But for their major big plastic releases, I don't think that we're likely to see a major release for the older style Space Marines again. As I believe that this is their way of refreshing the range, this kind of leads you to the conclusion that at some point Games Workshop is going to stop supporting the older non-primaris Space Marines. And we've seen a vehicle as to how that might go about with Warhammer Legends, where they basically retired the rules for a whole bunch of models that they don't make anymore, including things like the Chaplain on bike. a few exclusive releases like the Imperial Space Marine, and various options that chapters might have had in the past that you can't actually buy from Games Workshop. To be honest, the existence of Warhammer Legends is a good thing. It's certainly better than them just saying, no, you can't use those in the game anymore because we haven't sold them for ages. It's good that they're acknowledging that they existed at some point, and if you still have those models, then you can still field them in a game of 40k without them having to make massive maintenance on the rules all the time with every successive balance update. To be honest, I think it's fairly inevitable that at some point the entire non-primaris range is going to wind up there, and people are starting to wake up to that fact, and hence the question, should you start selling them now? When answering that question, it's worth bearing in mind that no model that Games Workshop releases will be supported indefinitely. As they have another look at each of the races and give them new codexes and new army books, they do tend to update kits all the time, particularly focusing on the oldest ones. Basically, the older the kit is, the more likely it is to have been replaced in any case, no matter what army you're in, whether or not you're part of this Space Marine Primaris or non-Primaris project in the first place. And although that we know that the end is in sight at some point in the future for all of the non-Primaris Space Marines, technically the end is in sight for pretty much every model that Games Workshop ever produces, although admittedly it's often like 20 years down the line after the kit was last updated. So though we know that older style Space Marines will be going away at some point in the future, it could actually be that a lot of other races have some of their core units updated before the phase out of non-Primaris Space Marines. Say for example, if they did release a new Imperial Guard kit that updated the standard Astra Militarum infantry, say with bigger bases and new and different options, that might potentially invalidate a whole load of older models. But we really just don't know what's coming in the future, so it's harder to predict that. Now, selling models from your collection, I'd generally argue, isn't something that you should do lightly, particularly if you are currently using them, or you could envisage using them in the future. With Games Workshop the way it is, we spend a lot of money to acquire these little pieces of plastic, and potentially invest even more in terms of time committed to assembling and painting the things. When you sell a miniature, you'll generally be selling it for less than the price that you paid it for, unless you're very good at painting, and even if you are good at painting, it's not likely to add any sort of appreciable value in proportion with the time and effort that you spent painting it. So in terms of having more models and options on the tabletop, if you do rush to sell your non-Primaris Space Marines very early, then sure you might get a very slightly better value for it, but you've also not got the value out of using those miniatures which you might have been able to for the next few years, and plus you'll lose any value from the time and effort that you've expended in making and painting these miniatures, and you'll have to start again with a Primaris project if that's what you fancy doing. However, if you aren't very interested in keeping a non-Primaris force on the table, either because you don't like having Marines and Primaris Marines on two different scales, which certainly bothers some, or you're just not interested in having them around after they're no longer supported as a core part of the game, then at some point it is going to make sense to sell. So that question will be, when will that time come? This is definitely going into prediction land now, but I honestly suspect it will be many years before Games Workshop ever retires the older style Space Marines. The main reason is because the range is absolutely enormous. To fully replace the Space Marine range, you'd have to be getting all sorts of tanks, artillery pieces, close combat specialists, veteran squads, flyers, thunderfire cannons, tech marines, all different variants of dreadnought, not to mention an enormous array of special characters, and also the unique faction-specific choices such as Deathwatch Veterans, Dark Angel's Death Wing, Raven Wing, and Blood Angel's Death Company and Sanguinary Guard, and we've not even mentioned everything there. A ton of the kits that I've mentioned, particularly things like the specialist versions, such as the Death Watch and the Sanguinary Guard for example, are reasonably recent and pretty high quality plastic kits that are still very popular with people. It's going to take a very long time for Games Workshop to get to re-releasing these sort of kits in Primaris form, and until that happens, I'd be very surprised if they were actually retired from the game. If they did, then they'd leave Blood Angels, for example, without their Death Company or Sanguinary Guard, and this would be a very unpopular move with them, and honestly, why would they remove them while they can still sell those kits? Furthermore, you could argue that some vehicles and flyers might not necessarily even need a Primaris replacement. I don't think it's going to be too obvious in a Primaris army if something like a Storm Raven was just declared as a Primaris flyer, and they just changed it to be able to transport Primaris Space Marines. So even if the rest of the old Space Marines were essentially removed from the game, some models might still persist and just be considered to be Primaris Space Marines from then on. All of this combined leads me to believe that we won't be seeing the death knell for the older style Space Marines for a very, very long time yet. When 9th edition is released, I strongly suspect that we'll see all the standard Space Marine units still supported, unless they actually do release some Primaris replacements of those units, particularly older units, in which case we might see things phased out. So far the only real example of this happening is Primaris upgrades replacing old characters. Particularly Games Workshop seems to have been focusing on the characters from the Space Marine back catalogue that have incredibly old models, such as the new Ragnar Blackmane, which at present I haven't seen, but it might well have been released by the time this video gets out. I wouldn't be too surprised if, say for example, they decided to fully replace the Space Marine bike squad when those new Primaris bikers that we've seen teased come out. But certainly don't take my word for this, they might well just release them alongside the regular Space Marine bikes as they've done with the Primaris before. So at least for a good few years, I'd only really be worried about Primaris Space Marines replacing your units if you're playing very old plastic kits or old Finecast models. I think that the older style Space Marines are going to be good to play for many years to come, and honestly I wouldn't really go worrying too much about things that are at least 3 years in the future and maybe more than that. For all you know, you might well not be playing Warhammer 40k in 3 years' time, for any number of real world reasons or losing interest in the game. So at least my advice and the strategy that I'm going with in the meantime is just to hang on to all of my regular sized Space Marines to give me different and interesting ways to build lists, but I am building up a healthy sized Primaris force alongside them, fielding them in mixed battles, and I am still occasionally purchasing older sized Marine units such as the Sanguinary Guard and Death Company that I bought for Blood Angels, because as I said, I really can't see these guys being replaced any time in the near future. Having said all that, I will be a little bit wary about starting an entire force that's purely older style Space Marines, as that's a big commitment in terms of time and money, and although you might get a good few years use out of it, it's not exactly very motivational knowing that its days are numbered right from the very start. So unless it's some sort of hobbying or fluff project, or you're thinking about using the miniatures in 30k as well, I'd mainly look to focus on getting Primaris models if you are starting a Space Marine army from scratch. So let me know your thoughts and opinions down in the comments below. I know that this is a bit of a controversial topic, everything I've said is purely my opinion, and if you disagree, please let me know about it. I'll look forward to reading what you have to say. If you've enjoyed this video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. We have new 40k content coming out every day, largely more tactics, articles and unit reviews, as opposed to buying and selling tactics. I do like to shake up these subjects every so often. If you'd like to support the channel and you happen to live in the UK, I do have an Element Games affiliate link which you can find in the description below. Basically, if you're thinking about ordering in some Warhammer from a discount supplier at some time in the future, consider giving that link a click and ordering through Element if you'd like some of the money to go to Auspex Tactics. It doesn't cost you any more money at all, it's just a cut of the profits, so it can be a nice way to support the channel if you were going to buy some models anyway. From my experience, Element have generally been pretty decent. I've never had any problems whenever I've ordered from them, so I can fully recommend them myself. In any case, thank you very much for listening to the video, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.